Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Arnie's Fantasy World of Sports here on the Lenny Melnick FantasySports.com network. Glad to be with you this morning. If you're listening live and in the chat room on Lenny Melnick FantasySports.com, it's good to see you guys. If you're listening to me on various podcasts such as iHeartRadio or Apple Podcast, you name it, there are probably others, then good morning to you as well. And today it's a little bit of a different show. I've been talking about position players. We started at first base. We went through the outfield. We did all the infield positions. I've spent the last, 4 podcasts talking about starting pitching. And so I've still got to do relief pitchers, but I'm going to treat those last because in my league, I treat them as their own little island. You've got North America, South America, then you got little Australia, right? So we're going to treat them as their own entity, and we're going to do that on another show. But here's what I want to do today. I've looked at all my rankings, and now I've come up with this idea. I didn't say a conclusion. I said an idea. Remember, differences between ideas and conclusions. Ideas can lead to conclusions. Conclusions do not breed for ideas. So here we go. With all the power, and I was listening to Phil Chaplin's show last night, and this really got me thinking about all the great power hitters. If you listen to Chappie's show, you benefited from it. If you didn't, go listen to it on demand, because he broke down the number of players who hit more than 50 home runs last season. He broke down the number of players who hit more than 40 home runs, and then those who hit more than 35. And what it taught me, and what I realized after doing my own analysis and then listening to his show last night, is there are a boatload of hitters out there. A boatload. And I want to give you some statistics. I love statistics. It backs up your argument. I want to go back 6 years, 2014. I want to talk about home runs. I want to talk about strikeouts and stolen bases for hitters. Okay, in 2014, there were 4,186 home runs hit. I'll go ahead and tell you, over the last 6 years, that is by far the lowest number. There were 37,441. I will tell you, by just barely the smallest of margins, that's the least number of strikeouts. And in 2014, there were 2,764 stolen bases in the major leagues. Over the last 6 seasons, that is the largest number. So we got the least amount of home runs, the least amount of strikeouts, and the most amount of stolen bases over the last 6 years in 2014. The most outlying year of the last 6. You know where this is going. 2015, home runs still below 5,000, but increased dramatically. Almost 750, or more than 750 more home runs in 2015 over 2014. You were up to 4,909. Only 5 more strikeouts, though, which I find very interesting. 37,446. Stolen bases down to 2,505. In 2016, 5,610 home runs. Now that's almost 1,500 more home runs than just 2 years earlier. Strikeouts up to 38,982, and stolen bases still around the same as the year before, 2,537. 2017, 6,105 home runs. 2,000 more than 3 years earlier. That's right. 40,104 strikeouts and still 2,527 bases. Now let's look at 2019. 6,776 home runs. Compared to 5 years earlier in 2014, that's a difference of 2,600 home runs, which tells you there are a lot more home runs available in fantasy than there were 5 years ago. Strikeouts now at 42,823. That's almost 5,400 more strikeouts than 5 years ago, which is consistent with more home runs. And stolen bases, 500 less than 5 years ago, 2,280. So those statistics as a whole tell me this. There's a lot of power out there relative to 5 years ago, more power than there has been. There are less stolen bases. So as I'm looking at drafts, I want to take a position, for example, and here are some facts. Some of these I may be repeating Chappie or I may be phrasing it a little differently. But 58 players last year hit 30 or more home runs. That's up from 11 from 2014. And in last year, remember, the 58 does not include fantasy stalwarts Mookie Betts, Javier Baez, or Aaron Judge. So right there are 61 players with 30 home run or more potential in this year's draft. Not counting rookies who may astound us all. So what we're looking at is there are a lot of players who are almost the same statistically. I want to take third base for a moment. I'm going to dig. I've prepared this for today. I'm going to dive deep, and I'm going to look at these third basemen last year. I'm going to look at their fantasy points per game, and we're going to look at their average draft position in this year's draft. Now, my average draft position numbers could be a little off, but they're not much off, depending on what league you're in. Let's start at the top with Anthony Rendon, who last year averaged the most points per game at third base, 4.3. 4.3. His average draft position this year is around 17 to 20. The second third baseman on the list, Alex Bregman. Points per game last year in fantasy, 4.22. And his average draft position this year is around 8, 7 to 9, somewhere in that range. Rafael Devers, 3.87 last year, points per fantasy game. And he's ranked around 25 this year. Fourth on the list, Nolan Arenado at 3.78. And Arenado could be drafted anywhere from 8 to 10. So, these top four, basically, one's as good as the other, and the range is anywhere from 7 in the draft on back to 23. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I mean, really interesting. DJ LeMahieu, the first number I'm going to give you is average fantasy points per game last year, and then I'm going to give you the 2020 average draft position. LeMahieu, 3.68 points per game. Average draft position this year around 70. Yuli Gurriel, 3.55 fantasy points per game. Average draft position around 135. Jose Ramirez, 3.43. Average draft position around 17 to 20. Muncy, 3.41. Average draft position around 74. McNeil, 3.40. Average draft position around 100. I'm just going to give you now fantasy points per game numbers, okay? Donaldson, 3.31. Escobar, 3.38. Bryant, 3.35. Sano, 3.35. Moncada, 3.23. Suarez, 3.20. Chapman, 3.20. Moustakas, 3.17. You see where this is going. I can add 4 more. Yandy Diaz, 3.10. Justin Turner, 3.08. And by the way, Yandy Diaz average draft position is around 250. Tommy Estrella, 3.05. And Tommy Edman, 3.04. What I'm getting at is, if you exclude Rendon, exclude Bregman, exclude Devers, exclude Arenado, your next highest ranking third baseman, average points per fantasy game, Eduardo Escobar at 3.38, and 20 players later, Tommy Edman, 3.04. This is an example of why hitters are so abundant. And I think it's important to note, if I were to do this at other positions, I'm going to find similar numbers. The last 16 players I just named in that third base list are basically the same player in fantasy. Points per game. That's right. Escobar from 3.38 all the way down to Edman at 3.04. There's 16 players in that group. Now, add Rendon, add Bregman, add Devers, add Arenado. There's 4. That makes 20. LeMahieu, Gurriel, Ramirez, Muncy, and McNeil. There's 26 players. After you get past the first 10, you've got 16 players who are basically the same. And there's not a huge drop-off, numbers-wise, from, say, number 10, McNeil at 3.40, all the way down to Edman at 3.04, who's at 26th on the list. The 16, I'm saying again, in that bottom group, from 10 to 26, are basically the same player in fantasy. Here's another factor. I'm just talking about the third base crop. But if you combine all the hitters, the number of players that scored between 3 points and 3.5 points per game last year, which is roughly the difference between Christian Yelich and Cody Bellinger, by the way, was about 60. 60 players between 3 and 3.5. So when you account for all other players being drafted, pitchers, rookies, breakthrough candidates, bounce back players who've been hurt last year, those 60 could go into what? 12, 13, 14 rounds. So how big a hurry are you to draft position players? Now, compare that or contrast that to starting pitchers. There's a huge chasm in the pitcher rankings. When you look at fantasy pitchers who scored over 15 points or more per game on average in 2019 in a points league, 26. Between 12 and 14.9 points per game, 28. And between 10 and 11.9, 45. Now, if you want me to do the math for you, that's 99 pitchers and only 26% of starting pitchers scored 15 points or more on average last year. So before I reach my conclusion, let's gather some more info. I'm just comparing or contrasting hitters now to pitchers. Now I want to talk about another category. As much as power is abundant, I told you earlier stolen bases are down. Over the last 5 years, 2,764 stolen bases in 2014, 2,280 stolen bases in 2019. That's a difference of around 500 stolen bases. And if you're talking about percentages, it's about a 16 or 17% decline. Excuse me, more than that, Arnie. It's a 20% decline, thereabout. And so I want to look at the leaders in stolen bases. I want to talk about players who stole 20 or more bases in 2019. And I want to give you their average draft positions, okay? I'm not going to give you, like Acuna stole over 30, but these, everybody I'm going to name, I'm going to give you your average draft position. I'm going to tell you, they all stole 20 bases or more in 2019. Acuna, Yelich, both in the top 5 of drafts. Lindor, Turner, Story, Jose Ramirez, Starling Marte, Alberto Mondesi, Whit Merrifield, Jonathan Villar, Victor Robles, Tommy Pham, Danny Santana, Elvis Andrus, Malik Smith, D. Gordon, Colton Wong, Manny Margot. Now, let's count those up. I just named 19 players. That's it. Only 19 players last year stole 20 bases or more. Now, notably off the list, guys like